On the outbreak of the 7 Years' War in 1755, William Pitt adopted forbade ideas with enthusiasm, leading to a policy which drained the Highlands of its best men to fight England's wars in Europe and North America. During this period no fewer than 10 line regiments were raised, 2 of which, in addition to the Black Watch, served in North America. They were Montgomery's Highlanders 77th Foot and Fraser's Highlanders 78th. All 3 regiments made their mark in the year 1758, but in 3 very different theaters of operations. The Black Watch in their heroic but futile stormed assaults upon the Abertines before Fort Ticonderoga, a Montgomery Highlanders forming the van of General Ford's successful expedition that captured Fort Duquesne, now Pittsburgh, and the Fraser Highlanders taking part in the siege and capture of Louisbourg. Of the 3, however, the 78th could rightfully claim to have been the first Highland regiment to have ever fought in Canada. The battalions were involved in overseas campaigns, in particular, for the 2nd Battalion in North America. Initially they were defending British colonists, in what was soon to become the United States, against the French and their Native American allies, particularly the Cherokees, on the western frontier. Traditionally, Scottish regiments cultivate a reputation of exceptional fierceness in combat and are often given romantic portrayals in popular media. William Pitt the Elder made the decision to raise new Highland regiments to fight in this Imperial War. The war ended in victory and, among other things, Canada was secured as a part of the British Empire. The ancient rivalries subsisting between Britain and France, and which had begotten so many fierce and sanguinary wars upon the European continent, were now about to be displayed with even a more exceeding bitterness among the colonists of the 2 nations in the New World of America. Disputes arising as to the boundary line of what they severally claimed as their territory, the might of France assumed to decide the right to maintain and defend British interests. An army, comprising the 2nd Battalion of the Royals, and the 2 newly raised regiments of Fraser's and Montgomery's Highlanders, was sent across the Atlantic in 1757. The first attack of this expedition was made upon the French island of Cape Breton, which, with its capital, Louisbourg, was speedily reduced. In the following year the Royals were engaged upon the American continent in a series of actions around the shores of Lake Champlain, which resulted in the capture of the strong forts of Ticonderoga, Crown Point, and ultimately the Okotoks. Several of the Indian tribes, taking advantage of our apparent embarrassments at this period, instigated by, and in some cases allied with, the French, threw off the British yoke, strove to recover their fatherland, or were encouraged, by hope of plunder, to assail our colonial settlements. Against the most powerful of these foes, the Cherokees, a few companies of the Royals, with Montgomery's Highlanders and other corps, were detached from the army, and proceeded to South Carolina. After repeated incursions into the country of the Cherokees, in which the foe was rarely seen, for when the Indian army of sable warriors did appear, our troops achieved an easy and ofttimes a bloodless victory. Still was our advance characterized by cruel and uncalled for severities, and marked by the melancholy spectacle of burning villages, in which lay the little all of these poor creatures. Unable to withstand our onset, with ruined homesteads, and threatened with all the miseries of want, their necessities impelled the Cherokees to sue for peace, which was readily granted. Between 1835 and 1845, about 15,000 Voortrekkers people of Dutch extract moved out of the British Cape Colony across the Erie or Orange River into the interior of South Africa. The reason for Britain's wish to keep the Boers under control is linked to the trade route north from the Cape. At first the Boers successfully drove the British back across the Orange River, inflicting a series of defeats on British troops arriving to deal with the crisis, culminating in a victory at Majaba in February 1881. The relationship between the Boers and the German nation was an unusual one. During the Boer War there was great support for the Boer struggle within Germany, and the Kaiser sent a telex to the Boers voicing his support for their war efforts. The Boers were armed with weapons made by Mauser and Krupp. Although the Boer commandos fought in a manner foreign to European battlefields, the artillery was well trained in European methods. Major Albrecht, the officer commanding the Orange Free State Artillery, was a German veteran. The German Free I Corps of Volunteers was formed, who fought on the Boer side. This included German officers and Graf Zeppelin, who was killed at the Battle of Eland Slagete. Another prominent European volunteer killed in action was the French Colonel Villebois de Marais, the Foreign Legion officer serving on the Boer side. The British response to guerrilla warfare was to set up complex nets of blockhouses, strong points, and barbed wire fences, partitioning off the entire conquered territory. In addition, civilian farms and livestock were destroyed as part of a scorched earth policy. Survivors were forced into prison camps. Very large proportions of these civilians died of hunger and disease, especially the children. After the surrender of Piet Cronje in the Battle of Paardenburg on February 27, 1900, Bloemfontein was occupied by the British troops under Lord Roberts from March 13 onward, and on May 28 a proclamation was issued annexing the Free State to the British dominions under the title of Orange River Colony. The big political shift came in 1904 when the British entered into the Entente Cordiale with France, which had long been regarded as one of its most strident colonial rivals. Disputes over the primacy of control over Egypt and Morocco were removed almost overnight. The seemingly nebulous borders between British and French colonies equally firmed up and took on more respectful attitudes to one another's colonial problems and issues. It was increasingly clear that the Entente Cordiale was aimed at containing the rising military and imperial aspirations of Germany. Germany did not acquire colonies before 1884–85, and these acquisitions in Africa and the South Seas were at first barely touched by their new masters. Historians talk of a paper occupation of Africa during the course of the Berlin Africa Conference, and indeed a few engagements by 1 or 2 Navy vessels off the coastline were all the German government initially afforded with regard to their new overseas possessions. Chancellor Otto von Bismarck was reluctant when it came to the expensive deployment of troops in Germany's African territories, which according to his plans should not have been colonies proper, but instead protectorates. In 1893, only 220 men were deployed to German South-West Africa, now Namibia. Perhaps unsurprisingly given the number of troops deployed, it would ultimately be political machinations, rather than German military might, that would lead to the signing of protection treaties by African leaders. Cape Dutch was not only spoken by the Boer population of Namibia, it served as the lingua franca in Nama and Hereland. Even if knowledge of the Ojibwe, Nama, Hamra or Osibambo languages remained limited among policemen, many of them were able to speak Cape Dutch, which was easier to learn for Germans. Vice Governor Hintrager spoke the language well. He had fought with the Boers in the South African War, and over the years several policemen achieved similar levels of fluency. Indeed, in the southernmost district of Warmbade, knowledge of Cape Dutch was considered a necessity for policemen. The southern bank of the Orange River was proclaimed the northern boundary of the Cape Colony in 1847, initially a landmark on a remote frontier across which people and commodities moved without hindrance. Between 1890 and 1915 the boundary, now on the northern bank of the river, was an enforced barrier between the British and a German colony, its problems contested in the imperial chancelleries of Europe and its functions hampered by an informal seepage of people mostly from German Southwest Africa to the northern Cape Colony. Germany at first had to invest its entire energy into preventing the British, who were also advancing from their Cape Colony, eager to occupy the hinterland of the German port, from encircling it in the barren wilderness of Helvoetsluis Bay. Hectically and far-reaching, the Germans expanded their colony by annexing uninhabited regions territoriales and signing so-called protection treaties with different Namibian communities far into the interior. In November 1900 Lord Kitchener sanctioned the raising of a regiment to be known as the Scottish Horse. Lord Tullibardine soon started recruiting from Scotsmen, or men of Scottish descent, in South Africa, chiefly in Natal, and on 4 February 1901 he took the field with 3 squadrons. To these other squadrons were soon added the volunteer service companies of Scottish regiments furnished no less than 200 men. To these their leader gave the highest possible praise. 100 of them were the best body of men in every way that I saw in South Africa. This particular squadron had a reputation which extended far beyond the column with which it was trekking. During the Gimbatha Rebellion, C Company of the Natal Rangers was recruited from men of the Transvaal Scottish Regiment, then called the Transvaal Scottish Volunteers. On May 5 over 1,000 of Gimbatha's warriors attacked the colonial forces as they were descending a steep ridge. Mackenzie tracked the rebels to the Bome Gorge, where he was able to encircle Gimbatha and his army and defeat them. Gimbatha's men were armed mainly with traditional short spears and shields, while Mackenzie's men had firearms. Gimbatha was captured and killed during the battle at Bome Gorge on June 10, while Sagananda and his men surrendered. Gimbatha was decapitated and his head displayed as a trophy by the colonial troops. Under the policies of British colonialism, people around the globe were subjected to mass famines, atrocious conditions in prison camps, and brutal massacres at the hands of imperialist troops. There were the prison camps in South Africa, where tens of thousands of the Boer population were detained in the first years of the 20th century. But the atrocity didn't stop there. While rounding up the Boers, the British also decided to detain any black Africans they encountered, 20,000 of whom were worked to death in slave labor camps. All told, British policy in the war killed 48,000 civilians. That's 18,000 more than the number of soldiers lost on both sides. In the 1950s, the people of Kenya decided they wanted their nation back. Fearing a countrywide rebellion, the British rounded up 1.5 million people and placed them in prison camps. Reliable estimates place the total dead in the tens or hundreds of thousands. Most of them were civilians or children, detained on vague, trumped-up charges of aiding the rebels. The inmates were used as slave labor. Above the gates were edifying slogans, such as labor and freedom and he who helps himself will also be helped. Loudspeakers broadcast the national anthem and patriotic exhortations. People deemed to have disobeyed the rules were killed in front of the others. The survivors were forced to dig mass graves, which were quickly filled. Although many cite India's extensive rail network as a positive legacy of British colonialism, it is important to know the railroad was built with the express purpose of transporting colonial troops inland to quell revolt, and to transport food out of productive regions for export, even in times of famine. This explains the fact that during the devastating famines of 1876 to 1879 and 1896 to 1902, in which 12 to 30 million Indians starved to death, mortality rates were highest in areas serviced by British rail lines. Deprivation kills, and it is estimated that 1.8 billion Indians died avoidably from egregious deprivation under the British 1757 to 1947. From Tasmania, where the whole people were virtually wiped out for resisting British rule in the Black War of the 1820s and 1830s, to Jamaica, where the Morant Bay Rebellion of 1865 led to a 6-week rampage by British troops, during which more than 400 people were killed and almost the same number summarily hanged, to Ireland and history of bloody terror from Oliver Cromwell's savage war of conquest in the 17th century to what the Irish historian Thomas Bartlett called the universal rape, plunder and murder wrought by British troops after the 1798 Irish Rebellion, to the brutal acts of revenge exacted during the Irish War of Independence by the Black and Tans, the British-controlled paramilitary police force, in the 1920s, to India, where some 3 million died in the Bengal famine of 1942 to 1943, caused by the British decision to export rice, for use in the war theaters and for consumption in Britain, from a state that usually imported rice, and at a time of great local shortage. The experience of the Order of the British Empire was cruel and ferocious. In 1807, Britain passed a law banning the slave trade. But for 3 centuries, that trade had been dominated by Britain. 3 centuries of savage enslavement, pitiless brutality, and casual mass murder.
And you would like